Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining us today for our CCK Live discussion. My name is Maura Black. I'm joined today by Elise Phillips and Mike Lestrito. We are at Chisholm and Kilpatrick, and today we're talking about new laws for veterans in 2021. So the discussion today stems from the new law that passed through Congress recently, the National Defense Authorization Act. And this new law goes through Congress each year, but each year the changes in it are different. And so we wanted to update everyone on some changes that they can potentially be on the lookout for to see if they affect your benefits, things that you might qualify for, whether you're a veteran or a current service member. Because again, as I said, the changes are different each year. So we wanted to go through some of the highlights from this year. The general categories of changes that we're going to talk about today, because there are so many of them, we wouldn't be able to get through all of them in one discussion or maybe even a couple. So we're just going to highlight some of the things that we found particularly interesting in the areas of the new presumptive conditions, which have been added through the Act, some additional exposure research, some healthcare and VBA or veterans benefits changes, and then some additional changes that are in place that will affect current service members. So, Mike, I wanted to start with you for the new exposure-related changes, both the new presumptive conditions that have been added to VA's radar, and also to some new toxic exposure research that has been contemplated by the new law.
So there was a measure that was included in the final version of the defense bill that actually granted the Department of Veterans Affairs or granted benefits from the Department of Veterans Affairs to really tens of thousands of Vietnam veterans. And these are veterans specifically who are believed to have been suffering from the effects of exposure to Agent Orange. So specifically in the bill or in the legislation, there includes a measure that would approve or provide benefits for Vietnam veterans who are suffering from three specific new conditions thought to be caused by exposure to the chemical herbicide agent in Agent Orange. And so to outline these three conditions, the first is bladder cancer. The second is hypothyroidism. And this is really a condition where the thyroid gland doesn't produce enough of the crucial hormone that is involved in that process. And the third and final condition that was included as a new presumptive condition in this piece of legislation was Parkinson-like symptoms. And so this involves symptoms like having tremors or maybe slow movement, impaired speech, muscle stiffness. And so all of those sorts of symptoms that are Parkinson-like symptoms now can be, under this piece of legislation, presumed to have been caused by a veteran's exposure to Agent Orange. So as a result of this, and this is a really important change that was brought about by the passage of this bill, veterans really don't need as much proof any longer to connect the dots in their case if they have one of these conditions and they can show that they were exposed to Agent Orange. So essentially that, we often talk about having a nexus or requiring a nexus to get service connection for conditions. And so what this does is for these three new conditions, VA will presume that if a veteran has been exposed to Agent Orange, that these conditions were the result of that exposure. And so this really has a wide, really expansive reach in terms of how many veterans it potentially affects. There's some estimates that it's over, approximately 34,000 Vietnam War veterans can be affected or will be affected by the passage of this legislation who may be suffering from one of these three conditions and now might be eligible to service connection for these benefits. So those are the three conditions. In addition to that, this piece of legislation included a measure to grant certain veterans access to the VA burn pit registry to help track exposure. And this is common in the specific base that we're talking here is really an old Soviet era air base in Uzbekistan. And it's known as the K2 base, or these are classified as K2 veterans. You might hear that term tossed about a bit. But what the legislation does is it will impact approximately 15,000 or more veterans who served at this base and who may have been exposed to dangerous levels of radiation or really other hazards. And so the bill included a requirement for more research to go into whether these veterans, these K2 veterans, did in fact suffer such exposure. And so the bill really is pretty critical, or the legislation that was passed is really pretty critical to adding those three conditions and looking more closely at potential exposure at this base.
And I know we've been tracking those new additions to the presumptives list for a long time. I'm pretty sure we did a video similar to this one last year, on the lookout for new developments in the law, and those three conditions were talked about even a year ago, and they've been kind of on the radar for a really long time. So thank you for that update, Mike. People who have been following the updates to the presumptives list might notice that hypertension is not yet part of the list of added conditions, which continues to be something that VA is supposed to be working on. So of course, if we have any developments about that in particular, we'll be sure to release those as we have them. Elise, I wanted to come to you now to talk about some healthcare updates that are contemplated in the NDAA. And before you start listing out the things that you have on your list, just a note that we are going to try to link a full copy of the NDAA in the comments associated with this video so that people can look through. They can look up some of the changes that we're talking about today to get more details, and then they can also see the other changes since the Act is a pretty expansive one. So that being said, Elise, can you talk to us about some healthcare updates?
So the first we're going to talk about is called the Deborah Sampson Act. It's within that long list of updates that you just mentioned. Specifically, this targets improvements for women veterans. Women veterans being one of the largest and fastest growing groups of veterans currently. So it's a sweeping healthcare bill. It's aimed to improve services and really remove some of the barriers that female veterans are currently facing. I'm not going to list everything here just because, as you mentioned, there's a lot. So again, if you want to read the full list, we are going to link the full act to this video. But some things that we do want to talk about is, first, it does mention gender-specific health care. So that means that VA medical centers will be covering things such as mammograms and other, specific women healthcare issues. It includes sexual harassment policies, which include trainings for VA employees. And it ensures that women's primary care is available during all regular VA business hours. It also establishes a separate office just designated for women's health. That wasn't a thing that previously VA medical centers were seeing. And it provides more funding for women's veterans programs in general. That can also include things such as military sexual trauma counseling, extended healthcare for newborns, and many more things that we really just weren't seeing in the, available to women's veterans before, are now going to be made available during this new amendment to the Act.
And I know that there might be some updates to caregiver policies.
Yeah, so with caregiver policies, really it's just going to require VA to formally recognize caregivers of veterans in those health records. Previously, that wasn't a requirement.
There are other miscellaneous changes, and when I say miscellaneous, it's not because they're not important, but it's because there are many of them, as Elise mentioned before. So there's a few changes that are affecting the benefit side of things that are a product of the NDAA for this year. One of those things is that the DIC remarriage age has been reduced from 57 to 55. So for those not familiar, DIC is a benefit that's available for surviving spouses of veterans who passed away due to their service-connected conditions or due to an event in service. And the current requirement, or it was current until this year and until this legislation passed, was that DIC benefits couldn't be continued to be offered to the recipient if there was a remarriage, if the recipient of those benefits remarried before the age of 57. That age has been reduced to 55. So the remarriage requirement is adjusted just a little bit to only come into play until the surviving spouse reaches the age of 55. And an additional thing that we've mentioned in other videos, because it has been an ongoing issue this year, at least in our practice, and I think it's affected a lot of other practitioners as well, is the removal of the copies of DBQs or disability benefits questionnaires from VA's public-facing website. So we've previously mentioned that VA removed the copies of the DBQ forms from their website, which deprives people the ability to use those forms and to have their private doctors or clinicians outside of VA fill out those forms. And this was a problem because, as we know, VA is very dependent on the forms that their agency produces. And so information that comes to them through their own standardized forms is usually treated differently, frankly, than evidence that comes through other means. So DBQs are a nice way for a private doctor to be able to list information about a veteran's condition, their medical disabilities, their relationship to service, their severity, all of which can be important information in disability claims. The NDAA has required VA to put those forms back on their website. So I believe we learned a little while ago that they had planned to do so. This act makes it official that they have to do so if they have not. And it would hopefully make it so that the removal of these DBQs from VA's website wouldn't be happening anymore. Regardless, we do have copies of all of the DBQ forms linked through our website, cck-law.com. So definitely feel free to take a look there if you're unable to access these forms, but they should be back on VA's website as a result of the NDAA. Mike, there are additional things about overpayments that I think are coming out of this act. I'm not exactly sure what the new rules are or how much it changes the process, but can you talk to us about relevant changes in the overpayment realm?
One of the issues that's really been fairly prevalent through the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic and still through to the present has been the issue of veterans receiving notices from the Debt Management Center trying to collect overpayment debts that may have been issued. So one thing that we see in our practice and many veterans may be familiar with is that if for whatever reason VA determines that they overpaid a veteran VA disability compensation benefits, oftentimes, though not always, but oftentimes VA will try to collect that debt or that overpayment back from them. And so this has, as I mentioned, this has really become an important issue as we've gone through the past year or so, as veterans may not be able to repay a lot of these debts like they may have been in the past. And so, although there has been some executive action to stall the collection of those payments, what this legislation did was, through the Veterans Debt Fairness Act, it really implemented new restrictions and new limitations on VA's authority to collect overpayments of benefits from veterans. So hopefully this provides some extended relief for veterans. At least speaking from my own practice, I certainly have seen a decrease in the notices that typically are sent out to veterans to collect overpayment debts. And so this is definitely welcomed relief, I'm sure, to many veterans who oftentimes, through no fault of their own, are presented with a situation where they received more benefits than they may have been entitled to, but weren't aware of it, or again, it was through nothing they did on their end. So hopefully this legislation can help provide some relief on that front.
I totally agree, Mike. I've also seen a reduction in the number of overpayment notices that are coming through, which is great. And I agree, this is definitely a welcome change. Elise, I wanted to come back to you for some additional healthcare related topics, but I believe that this pertains more to benefits because VA has, through the NDAA, expanded the amount of healthcare type research that they're going to be conducting. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Basically, they're expanding funding for certain research that's specific for specific areas or specific conditions, rather. So unlike what Mike was talking about before, where we are really seeing an addition to the presumption here, this is just for research. We're not really sure what's going to come out of it yet. But it's certainly a good thing because there is, with these four areas, there's a lot of uncertainty especially with, service connection and rating. They're more complicated areas. So the first is going to be for ALS, then for eating disorder treatment, for TBIs or traumatic brain injuries, which is it's a big one that we see in our practice, and then also for musculoskeletal conditions, another big one that we see here at CCK. So expanding research for that, and we'll see what comes out of it.
And that actually reminds me that another change that we may have mentioned in a previous video or will in the future is that in addition to the NDAA, there have been some changes to the musculoskeletal rating criteria. So that's another thing to be mindful of. You may see some differences in the way that VA is classifying certain musculoskeletal conditions, diagnostic codes, or the criteria for those. So just while we're on the topic of some changes in the law, that's probably worth mentioning. There are other changes where I'm going to briefly mention that affect current service members. And Mike, I'm going to ask you to help me out with some changes about the military pay raise, which I think is probably the most significant of these and the most far-reaching. But other issues that are worth mentioning are first that the criteria for home loan eligibility for National Guard members has been relaxed a little bit. So previously, in order to be eligible for a home loan, a National Guard or reservist would have to be serving for 90 consecutive days on active duty. And I believe the requirement has been relaxed to only 30 days consecutive with 90 days total of duty service. So that's worth noting. And another area where we have noticed some changes, and again, you'll want to look through the actual text of the NDAA to get more specifics, is with the GI Bill. There have been some additional edits made to the criteria for the GI Bill eligibility. So if that affects you, you definitely want to take a look at the changes. Mike, as I said, there has been an adjustment in the military pay rate. So can you tell us about that?
So as part of this act, Congress did approve 3% military pay raise for current service members, and that's effective or was effective January 1st, 2021. So what this does is it essentially matches or nearly matches the raise that was included for fiscal year 2020. I believe there was approximately a 3.1% increase in pay. And at the time, that was the largest, and it still is the largest pay increase for service members over the past 10 years. So again, as of January 1st of this year, a 3% increase in pay for military current service members, and that includes actually an approval in this piece of legislation that raises the hazardous duty incentive pay. Previously, that pay, which is paid monthly for service members who have duty in a foreign area that's designated as an imminent danger area or kind of a high risk area. Previously, that pay was at the $250 per month rate. As a result of this act, that is being increased to $275 per month. So we've got a slight bump there and a 3% increase in military pay as of the first of this year.
I think that concludes most of the changes that we wanted to mention on our list. Again, this is not an exhaustive list of the changes that have been brought about by the passage of the NDAA this year. Elise, did you want to conclude with any final thoughts, any words of advice for people who might be interested in learning more about all these changes?
Yeah, sure. So, of course, if you want to learn more, we're going to link that full NDAA text below. But I think one thing that's really timely that I should mention is that they've also included some things COVID-19 related. So specifically, veterans homes, for example, are going to be required, state-run veterans homes are going to be required to indicate and report any COVID cases or COVID-related deaths. And that's going to be right in the text of the NDAA. So,
as Elise mentioned, we will definitely be sure to link any resources that we think might be helpful to you along these lines. Please do not hesitate to visit our blog, our website at cck-law.com. We have other articles that might be timely or relevant to what we discussed today. other videos, of course, of other relevant areas that we've talked about in the past. So definitely take advantage of what we've got there. And thank you, Elise and Mike, for joining me today. And thank you to everyone out there. We hope you're all doing well, and we hope to see you again soon.